Okay, so we'll now start with we'll go on with our panel on telecommunications, which, as Rob implicitly pointed out, there's some overlap between the two. There's always more and more overlap. So let me first, well, actually, before I start, I'm sure everyone in this room who's been watching Twitter knows that Chairman Wheeler announced that he, on January 20th, will step down, resolving what passes for intrigue in Washington. But as we go along, maybe panelists might want to talk about it if they have something to say. We can get to that later. But so first, let me introduce the panelists. And alphabetically, starting from my left, we have Carolyn Brandon, who is a Senior Industry and Innovation Fellow at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, where she focuses on competition and regulatory policy. She's also served as Vice President for Policy at CTIA, and before that was a partner at Wilkinson Barker. Was voted one of the top 10 women in wireless.
At the beginning of the industry, isn't that 20 years ago?
About the 20. Well, you would still be one of the top 10 people in wireless, right? And next to her is David Goldman, who is the Chief Counsel for Communications and for the Communication and Technology Subcommittee. He has a long and impressive career navigating between Congress and the FCC. Before working in the subcommittee, he served as the senior legal advisor for FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, and before that was counsel to the Subcommittee on Communications Technology and the Internet, and also served in Chairman Jankowski's office as a policy advisor and as a policy advisor to the Chief of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. He's going to explain to us how the opposition will function in a Republican era. Next to him is Tom Hazlett, who not only holds the H.H. Macaulay Endowed Chair in Economics at Clemson University, but also has a Bloody Mary in front of him, because I promised him one when I said that he needed to be a little bit lubricated to speak.
Wait a minute while I drink this.
And you ask for a celery stick, which you'll get if you, depending on how well you perform. He was
Bloody Mary.
he was.
I didn't know you were taking drink orders, Scott. This is a whole new kind of panel.
Tom's also served as chief economist at the FCC and has held faculty positions at UC Davis, Columbia, Wharton, and George Mason. His most important affiliation, of course, is that he's part of TPI's academic advisory board. Brian Tremont is a managing partner for Wilkinson Barker, and he's also an adjunct law professor at the Catholic University Communications Law Institute and a senior adjunct fellow at University of Colorado Boulder. And the most amazing thing is that he's been awarded the Best Lawyers in America 2017 Lawyer of the Year for Media Law and Lawyer of the Year in Communications Law. It's not even 2017 yet.
It's an amazing marketing machine they have, yes.
Yeah.
They send you the plaque early. Whoever pays for it wins the award.
That's right. Before joining WBK, Brian served as chief of staff to FCC Chairman Michael Powell, and then was also Chairman Powell's senior legal advisor, and has served with Commissioners Kathleen Abernathy and Harold Furchtgott-Roth.
Are we done with the panel now?
Yes, now we're done. So the first question that I want to pose is pure speculation. It's sort of become conventional wisdom that the regulatory apparatus is going to shift from favoring the Googles of the world to favoring the ISPs of the world. And with talk of rolling back net neutrality and Title II, which of course are things that we'll come to. But on the other hand, yesterday's tech summit didn't include anybody from this industry. As far as I know, Trump hasn't done anything to reach out to people from this industry. And his infrastructure plan mentions the word telecommunications, but it seems to me almost begrudgingly. I might be reading something into that. Now, given that and his relationship with Peter Thiel, do you still believe this is going to be an administration that generally favors ISPs? Brian?
I was going to say, this will be my one and only initial reaction to a question, and then I will be reactive to everyone else. So when you phrased it, I think you were looking down the table. I don't know if you were purposefully looking at Brian as the source of this common wisdom.
I was trying to cover everybody with my look.
I mean, I think, well, we don't know what everyone else is going to say, but I think what I find personally just frustrating at this point in the process is we don't know. And, you know, I get that there are headlines that will drive eyeballs and stories, and a lot of it is making all kinds of predictions about who's going to do what and how certain issues are going to be worked out. And again, I just think it's too early. I think trying to read into what that meeting means in terms of a long-term relationship between the president-elect and the tech community is rather pointless. What that meeting might signal vis-a-vis what the
Did you just say my
president...
question was pointless?
I think anybody trying to read into that, the fact that the meeting happened and who was there as somehow, you know, indicating what the president-elect and his team and the FTC and the FCC and the DOJ and all of these other agencies that actually will be working with these companies is also, you know, a fool's errand. If we are going to just play in pure speculation, then I would suggest, you know, what about all the rumors that Peter Thiel has issues with Facebook and Google? I would argue if that's really true, then I don't know, maybe the ISPs will do just fine. Honestly, I think the way this is going to break down is like it does every other new election, which is it's going to depend entirely on who is at the agencies that these companies have to deal with, and that will have more impact over how particular issues are determined than any particular personality issue or personal opinion in the White House or Trump Tower, depending on where they live. So over to you.
Thanks, Carol. Okay, sure. So I actually think the new administration will and should favor the builders and the job creators. And I think that ISPs qualify on both of those fronts. If you look at the number of people employed in those sectors and you look at the diversity of the employment up and down the economic chain, if you look at the tens of billions of dollars that have been invested in infrastructure by our wireline, our cable, our wireless providers, it's an extraordinary growth engine for the country, and I think the new administration will appropriately focus on trying to drive more investment, more job creation. And I think that's been a shortcoming in a lot of ways of the current administration, and I think it'll be a strength of the next one.
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with what Carolyn was saying. I mean, you phrased it as conventional wisdom, and I'm not sure that applies right now. Conventional wisdom doesn't seem to be all that conventional lately.
Or accurate.
But it's I think there's probably more unknown right now than from any time I can remember. That won't stop me from having an opinion. But it's absolutely right. We don't know whether the administration is going to go with a more kind of conventional pick at the agency or conventional picks at the agency, or if they're going to go. One of the things from the outside watching the picks for the other agencies, it seems to be people actually not within the universe of those agencies. So I think that still remains to be seen. And from where I sit in the House, I mean, we still have a lot to be decided within even our committee on how things move forward. We, on the majority side, the chair of our committee and the chair of the subcommittee have both been term limited out. The chair of the subcommittee has moved to the chair of the committee, so maybe that says that there'll be some consistency, but we still don't know who the leadership on the subcommittee is, and on the Democratic side, we haven't done committee assignments at all yet. So I think there's a lot to still be decided and a lot up in the air. So I agree with you on what the conventional wisdom is, just I'm not sure that that has that much weight right now.
Yeah, I do want to say thank you very much for having me, and I feel a little badly about it, though, because I just was recalling that I once invited the late Gordon Tullock to give a talk in a speaker series, and the subject of honorarium came up. He said, "Just pay me what you pay everybody else in the series." That was an interesting response. But as we sit here today, I know that there's a little bit of tension that's developed here because I've got the Bloody Mary.
Exactly.
But, I mean, people are going to have to negotiate for this. And anyway, yeah, so the answer to your question is yes, there will be a shift. We don't know, the parameters. We can guess the direction. We were probably at one polar end with certain policies, and I mean the current administration, meaning the FCC, had already backed off in practice from doing what it said it wanted to do theoretically anyway, and it had to. It couldn't really be non-discriminatory on a mandatory basis, and net neutrality and some of the proceedings like set-top box were just an extension to just an effort to extend regulatory futility another generation or two, I suppose. So a lot of that stuff was going to happen behind the scenes. Now it may happen a little more openly, may happen in Congress as well. Obviously, what everybody knows to be true and what Carolyn has just said is that variance has gone way up. The question comes up, everybody in this room has probably been asked, what is Trump going to do? The correct response is, how should I know? Mr. Trump doesn't know. So here we are. When variance in Washington goes up, that's very good for Washington, isn't it? That's very good for the business services that are sold here. So, that's sort of the constant.
Can I just follow up on one thing on the infrastructure point that you raised about the stimulus or whatever this package is going to be called? I guess two observations. One is that the sector, the ISP sector, has invested a substantial amount of money without a stimulus program per se. I think it's one of the unique sectors in that, unlike building roads and other things, it's about removing some regulatory barriers and encouraging people to build with private capital much more than it's about a federal government program. We saw the efforts in the beginning of the Obama administration to spend money in this sector. It was a, at times, tortured experience. I don't know that people feel like that money was always well spent. And so I think that it would be wise in some ways for the administration to focus on removing barriers that allow even more private sector investment in this space, which means infrastructure, things like rights of way, improved policies, and getting rid of any overhang on BDS services, et cetera, and shifting it to facilitating the kind of private investment that I think has been in some ways slowed by the Title II and other regulatory steps that this administration has taken.
So, I mean, that leads right to the question of Title II and net neutrality and so on, and everyone seems to think that the two Republicans who remain were opposed to these sorts of rules, and the people on the transition team are are known to oppose them also. So, I guess, is it safe to assume that there will try to be some rollback? What's the mechanism that they do it? Where does Congress come into it? And David, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, exactly. Congress is at the end, David. You got that question.
He's sitting stone-faced, didn't say I didn't want to answer. I mean, again, we have to see what happens to the agency to know what they're going to do, and I think that they have a number of different options. Clearly, the two commissioners the two Republican commissioners are outspoken on these issues, and we know where they stand. But how they go about doing it, I think there's still a lot to be seen, and it takes time. So nothing's going to happen in January. That said, so where does Congress come in? All I can tell you is what Congressman Pallone, the ranking member on the committee that I work for, what he's been saying is that he's a legislator. He likes to legislate. When there's big issues that affect a lot of consumers, he's always open to having those conversations. He's always going to be open to talking about legislation. That said, I know what a lot of people are thinking, but for him, he's not going to take a bad deal. He's not going to be forced into something that he thinks where consumers are going to end up getting harmed from this. So that's always going to be the question. And I mean, it's always going to be the question for him is how do consumers come out in this? And he's not going to be willing to sign on to legislation where he feels like consumers are not coming out ahead.
So let me just throw out 2 points. One, I do think, regardless of where you stand on the issue of Title II and net neutrality, I think, unless your job is to professionally just advocate one way or the other, I think everybody is just tired of the back and forth on this issue. And I mean that seriously. I don't mean just, as a topic. So I think there will be a very serious and thoughtful focus, not just on what possibly might be done at the FCC from a regulatory perspective, but what can be done legislatively. Because I don't think anybody wants to, again, even if the calls for blowing up the FCC and we're going to get rid of Title II and we're going to get rid of net neutrality, let's assume all that is actually possible and happens. Well, there will be another election in 4 years, and I think people do not, especially these companies who are making multi-billion bets right now, not just in terms of their ongoing infrastructure deals, but if you take a look at the way in which the very large part of the ecosystem here, I'm defining it as larger than telecom, there's a lot of moving and shaking. People are trying to figure out what is their growth over the next 10, 15 years. So we are at a time in the industry where the appetite for swinging from one extreme to the other in terms of A, predictability, and B, awareness of what you can actually monetize in terms of the money that you're putting into your network or to whatever it is you're running. I just really don't think that the companies have the appetite to see that the swing back. So I think what we end up seeing is probably something that has two pieces to it, regulatory as well as legislative. And I just wanted to pick up really quickly on something David just said, which is this focus on the consumer. I think one of the frustrations, at least if you are a part of this broader ISP industry, has been, despite a lot of claim coming out of the FCC about wanting to make decisions based on facts and based on analysis, that very often some of these very large decisions tended to be made more on the politics with complete disregard for what was in the record. And I think there is a desire to try to help, see that swing back more towards a real careful analysis. You might end up disagreeing with the facts in the record and the analysis, but at least, go through it and embrace it. Number one. Number two, and I think there was also a frustration that perhaps policies were wrapped in the context of being pro-consumer, but in fact really sort of smelled as if it was really just about favoring one particular company or one part of the sector over another. And I think to the extent you can see these agencies, or in particular the FCC, moving away from that and back more towards a true focus on the consumer and a focus on the actual analysis and thoughtful data contributions to the conversations, I think that's going to have that should have a very positive impact for all the players, not just ISPs, but also edge players.
I just want to agree with Carolyn on one point to start, which is it is a legal insanity that depending on who's in the White House, broadband service is either an integrated information service or it's a standalone communication or has a standalone communication service component. That's insane. It's no way to run a country. It's no way to run a multi-billion-dollar sector of the economy. So I underscore the need for certainty. It makes no sense, and it's remarkable to me that courts have allowed the commission to date to get away with that. I think there are three paths to roll back the rules here. There's the courts, the FCC, and Congress. I think you'll see action at the FCC for certain. I think the courts, if there is a grant of rehearing en banc or a cert grant or what have you, you'll see some additional activity there. And then my hope is that on a bipartisan basis, Congress will step up and solve this problem for the long term, as Carolyn alluded to. And my hope is, there's some foundations out there, right? There's legislation that had bipartisan support in 2010. There's been other efforts to get closer to a deal. I think we've moved a long way from the initial stages of this debate. I think there are two big sets of issues. There's classification, and then there's the open internet rules. I think we've made real progress on a general consensus on what open internet rules look like, which can be done on a bipartisan basis. And so I think there's a foundation to get this done. And my hope is that they will indeed do it, and hopefully within the first year of the administration.
So are you saying sort of just a broad-based maybe Telecom Act reform and getting rid of even the concept of classification?
I think that's too ambitious. I think the more likely outcome is a straight open internet piece of legislation that gets that done. I don't know, you're closer to it than I am. I think if we try and bite off more than that, it's too hard to do, potentially.
I don't know. It's all I hear is about how Congress is going to push through all this legislation in the next 6 months. So
We're going to be very busy.
I have high hopes that by May this will all be done.
I gave you a year.
So I don't know. I think, like I said earlier, I mean, even within our committee, nothing is set yet. It's just I think it's premature for me to speculate on where it's going to go.
You might want to defer to the man who's already won awards for 2017.
But all of this is also based on the premise that the FCC actually operates as an independent agency, and that was one of the complaints over the past few years. And obviously, something nobody knows, but it assumes that the president just allows the FCC to operate independently. And his comments so far, which may turn out to mean absolutely nothing, suggest that he may not be so inclined. Not that there can really be any response to that because he'll tweet something else tomorrow.
Right. I guess I would only say that I have found as an FCC alum, I have found it deeply troubling the degree to which this administration has felt comfortable giving direction to the FCC on specific issues, and it's happened so many times, whether it's Title II or it's mini broadband or it's E-rate. There's just been an extraordinary number of cases, set-top boxes, where they have been very transparent in their desire to have the agency do certain things, and I find that troubling. I hope that will not be a trend that continues.
Is there a difference? Let's say that Trump takes an interest in what the commission looks like, rather than just being, being involved directly in its policies. Is there a difference? Is there any way to decide whether there's a difference between a Trump approach to telecom as opposed to a Republican approach to telecom?
I mean, I think the obvious one up front is talking about media mergers. I mean, what he said in the campaign, and I think there's a lot of people who are assuming he walks away from it, but he's had a lot of skepticism about media mergers in the media market, which, I mean, I can't speak for Republicans, but I haven't traditionally heard from my counterparts. So that's one of the places that I think I'd be looking for to see whether or not that stays, whether we stay with campaign promises or whether it changes to more what like I said, as I've heard from my counterparts going forward. That said, I mean, so one thing that I just have to push back a little bit on Brian on is the talk about this past administration. I guess that's my job now.
I was just throwing that up for you.
I know. I have to embrace my new role.
There we go.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's right that you can say that the President of the United States is the one person in the United States who's not allowed to have an opinion and weigh in with the FCC. I think the president is allowed to have an opinion. I think the commission has said when he's weighed in that they took that into account, but it wasn't the thing that the whole decision was based on. I think the proceedings that Brian was referring to, I think there's plenty of record supporting where the FCC came out, even aside from anything that the administration had said. So I don't think that the outgoing administration was near as guilty as Brian may have led on.
Not as guilty. So I guess I find it troubling, once again, from an institutional perspective. We go around the world talking about the importance of having an independent agency outside of the executive branch. And I think that when the president makes a video telling the FCC what to do, that sort of makes it harder to make that case. And I'm not saying he can't have an opinion. I just think that the degree to which he was clear and aggressive in expressing his view is troubling.
All right, I hope the next president is not clear in his views.
Fair enough. You might get your wish.
Got your wish.
But I mean, the place where I do agree. I mean, it is an independent agency, and the reason it's independent, and now I'll speak to where I currently work. It's independent from the executive, not from Congress. This is delegated authority from Congress,
Right.
And that's absolutely right. And that I hope that the incoming FCC is respectful to Congress and does take its lead from Congress. Because yes, they're operating on power that was given from Congress, not from the executive.
But Brian, then, I mean, you should be, or are you concerned then when he tweets things about a proposed merger, which maybe you would say it's Justice Department and that's executive branch, but.
Oh, that's good. Let's do that. Yes, it's executive branch. That's the word I'm going to go back to. I do. He is not the president of the United States at the moment. We will see what happens when he occupies the office. We'll see. If the future president of the United States tweets about pending proceedings at the FCC and tells them what to do, yes, I would prefer that they not do that, if that's the question.
So Scott, going back to your I think the question was, do you think there will be a distinction between a Trump presidency versus, quote, a Republican presidency? And again, going back to we really don't know. Every day we wake up and we learn something new and different about our president-elect and what he thinks and what he doesn't think. And I think one observation that has held true is he's really not a traditional Republican if you think about philosophy of regulation writ large. He's also not a traditional Democrat, so he's sort of this hybrid thing. If you take a look at sort of who he's pulling into his cabinet, putting aside, lots of interesting commentary, they are coming from the business sector, and that does seem to be consistent with sort of a 100,000-foot characterization of Trump, which is he certainly is someone who would want to see government move out of the way and have business be allowed to do what it does. So what can you extrapolate from that sort of generic 100,000-foot perspective and apply it to telecom? Maybe as a general matter, maybe he'll be a little bit more independent when it comes to the FCC. Maybe he will be maybe his perspective will foster, again, that return to sort of what are the facts and what does the law say, as opposed to a more interventionist style of shaping policy. But again, I go back to my initial observation, which is I think that is going to have more to do with who's at the FCC, FTC, DOJ, et cetera, than particularly what he thinks about any particular deal or transaction or rulemaking.
Let's talk about spectrum for a minute. Tom, this spectrum has been your one of your main things for years. Do you see a turn towards policies that you've advocated over the years, more licensed overlays, things like that? And if this administration is likely to turn more towards licensed spectrum, how will it treat the incentive auction, which it may consider to be a democratic initiative?
Yeah. Thank you for asking about spectrum. And but I have to say, just on this previous issue, and it was a good defense of President Obama and his views. But I thought, and maybe I'm being helped here, but I thought maybe the solution is that the president should file ex parte reports for his expression, because when you say they were public, not always. So let's get ex parte reports, and then that immediately led me to think of the next president filing an ex parte report at the FCC, and that delighted me no end.
We could put tweets in the record.
You could tweet the ex parte report. That's right. With spectrum, there is disruption coming potentially. And that might well be good. Again, the variance is high. It might not be so good. Now, we are running a big experiment at the FCC, and that has a lot of positive aspects to it. One is that in 2010, the Commission did basically find that several decades of spectrum allocation policy had gone in the wrong direction, over-allocating to over-the-air broadcasting, and was way past time to move things out, and came up with an innovative quote-unquote market-based structure, which most of you are well aware of, the so-called incentive auction. I always have to say so-called because incentive is just marketing. Incentive auction. That's good marketing for a government agency, I might add, but all auctions have incentives. That's the whole point of an auction, is to reveal through monetary incentives what the actual demand characteristics in the market are. But the incentive auction has now been under consideration since 2009, reported out as a recommendation in 2010, and what year? 2017 now? Okay. And spectrum is not turned around, won't be turned around for some time. And there's not going to be 294 megahertz, which is the TV band, and there's not going to be 120 megahertz, which was the 2010 proposal. And we're hoping there's 70 megahertz, which is the current state of play in the incentive auction, and certainly maybe less or maybe nothing, actually. The auction may not close. So I think that we really do need to take a hard look at what we've learned here. As I say, there's many good aspects to this. Agencies, it was, Rob or Scott said agencies should not be punished for trying reasonable, innovative approaches, and this is a reasonably innovative approach. But there are alternatives that are equally or more promising, and Scott mentioned overlays. So we have a lot of experience with allowing the markets to actually assemble and reassemble rights, so long as regulators do get the rights in the market in a way that can be worked with at reasonable transaction cost. And so I really think that we have to take a hard look at this and see whatever we get out of this. Broadcasting is still going to be over-allocated in any event, with much more spectrum than consumers want to pay for there. The irony being, video is going to other delivery modes, and we need the spectrum out of television to provide television. But that's just economics. That's very straightforward. We're just we're doing the regulation wrong, and we have to come up with more progressive ways to do it. So I'm very hopeful that there may be a shakeup here in terms of at least taking the suggestion to critically scrutinize what's happened in the whole incentive auction approach and get something that's faster, more protein in turning that spectrum loose, and gets us to our objective in terms of market reallocation.
Since nobody knows what anything's going to be like, can you rephrase that as what you think should happen? If they came to you and said, "What should spectrum policy look like? We'll do whatever you say," because
This is a good story. I like this part.
yeah, you like to shake things up. What should we do? And then David had a response. No.
And I swear I didn't ask him to ask me that, but that's the easiest question I've ever gotten in my entire life. And that is, I already told the FCC in 2009 exactly what to do, and they were very polite in the national broadband plan, and said, well, we can't do this because there are too many transaction costs. We're going to do it the simple way. We're going to have the government do an incentive auction. So, which, by the way, is more recently been referred to as the FCC by the chair of the FCC as a Rubik's Cube. So, so I don't know why complexity is all of a sudden simple.
You should
and
see how quickly
simplicity
eighth
is
graders can solve
complexity.
that thing.
Yeah. So I would just give out, for example, in the television band, 49 channels, 294 megahertz of wonderful spectrum, just about overlay rights for the whole thing. The overlay rights. I had a little plan in the filing. Happy to send it to anybody who's actually interested. The special delivery to New York City. The idea is the overlay rights are secondary rights to use all the spectrum that's currently being used. You grandfather all the existing users in, like the TV stations. They have all the same rights that they ever had. Don't touch them. But you have the overlays come in. The overlays use all the TV band spectrum. You have competitive, I recommended 7 national overlay licenses. You can have any combination. But anyway, so the overlay rights allocate to some new user, presumably these are decided by auction, some new user to use all the unoccupied, all the unused TV channels, and to have secondary rights to all the existing TV channels. That means there can be negotiations between the new users and the current licensees. In fact, the new users may be the current licensees. The TV stations may bid in the auction or have partnerships, almost certainly would have partnerships with wireless companies to try to turn spectrum around and participate in such an auction. So the overlays have been done in PCS, they've been in AWS, they've been done many places and have worked. We work pretty well. We certainly can tweak them and make them work a little better on our experience, and there are good discussions and research projects. And don't worry, there's some consulting and legal work on that, I should say here.
Well, actually,
National
since
Press
that was the easiest question you ever gotten, I thought I'd follow up with one that makes sure you never get another consulting contract. Unlicensed spectrum has become a lot more popular, including with groups that used to ardently oppose unlicensed spectrum. Where does unlicensed fit?
Yeah, well,
in
there's
your world.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a confusion here that to get the kinds of applications that people talk about commonly associated with unlicensed, like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, that we need to have certain allocations. And in fact, you even alluded to this earlier when you talked about lobbyists deciding allocations rather than consumers. And so what really needs to happen is that let's just take some of the easiest example. We've got lots of debates in this country, not between licensed and unlicensed, but between unlicensed flavor A, unlicensed flavor B. And the question is, how can we settle these disputes? Well, it's just a very standard problem. The government doesn't know how to do this. We want to get away from case-by-case spectrum allocations. That is the problem. And we don't want to have this administrative assignment of rights when the market has so much more information and so much possibility for competition to release innovation, and to discover, to come up with one good idea or one bad idea, discard it quickly and go to something else. And so we need to do something that FCC economists have talked about, and others have a new book coming out in 2017, by the way, and you can you can pre-order it on Amazon. You can pre-order. I haven't gotten any awards for it yet, but I think those are.
Apparently, Tom's daughter already pointed out that it's been the price has already been cut.
Yeah, and I saw it last Saturday. It was actually listed for sale on Amazon. The title, by the way, "The Political Spectrum." You want to write? I'll go slower. "The Political Spectrum." The tumultuous liberation of wireless technology from Herbert Hoover to the smartphone. So yeah, it is, and as my 18-year-old daughter noted when I proudly showed her the Amazon listing, she said, "Daddy, it's already been discounted and it's not even published yet." The next sentence, she's just taking her Econ 1. She said, "I wonder what the demand for, what they think the elasticity is for your book." So. Anyway, no, there is a description certainly of how overlays can and have worked and how they could work in the future. And the FCC obviously is seriously done this, looked at this. Other regulators around the world should be looking at this. The idea of an overlay for unlicensed, the implications are clear. And in fact, there are FCC working papers written on it. You can have groups that want to have spectrum used one way, bid as consortia for the licenses. Certainly consortia bid for licenses already, and we can go through some of those examples if you like, but you have the groups that are saying, let's do it unlicensed this way, go ahead and bid. And trade associations or corporations or nonprofit groups, even public agencies could bid. And you want the demand revelation to stack up against other possible business models. And this is just competitive innovation. That's all it is, innovation in business models. And so, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of freedom that has been unleashed because of a relaxation of important rules and unlicensed going back to the 1980s. And that's been very helpful. But what is not helpful is the case-by-case spectrum allocation process in Washington that ties all allocations, licensed, unlicensed, and all flavors, ties it up in these long battles where you now have car companies battling internet and cable companies, and I can just show you the debates from the 1940s on FM allocations that just mimic exactly the same kinds of arguments that are used about, oh, that hasn't been used.
Before you
well,
do,
this has been
David's
used.
been really incredibly patient as his worldview has been attacked.
Scott, quit interrupting me. The book is 398 pages long. And by the way, you did buy me the Bloody Mary.
Wow, I don't remember anymore. No, so yeah, no. Thanks for putting me this in panel, so I get a feel for my next 4 years. I had a scotch before I came here. So I kind of wanted to maybe reframe the narrative from the last few years on what's happened with spectrum. In 2010, the FCC came out with the broadband plan where they identified a bunch of spectrum bands that could be auctioned and were candidates for flexible use licenses, some of it unlicensed. That was 2010. By 2012, Congress actually passed a law on this, using a lot of the ideas, including the incentive auction. That doesn't I mean, that's the last major telecom law that's passed. So that doesn't happen very often, and that happened within a couple of years of the broadband plan coming out. Since then, we're 4 years later from that law, and I mean, the incentive auction is one piece of it, but we've had the H-block auction, we've had the AWS-3 auction, which was the most successful auction in history, and we don't know how the incentive auction is going to turn out. But I would point out, when this thing was starting, people were questioning whether the software would even work. So, I mean, the fact that we are where we are is actually not a bad thing. And if you look back and skip where it's going to come out, actually, if you look back at where analysts were predicting where this auction would come out, it was about 84 megahertz, somewhere in the mid 20 billion range, which is still a possibility. And so if the auction does end around there, we're going to have 100-something megahertz that get put out just through auctions, not counting things like AWS-4 that I know Brian had a lot to do with of getting that out there. I actually would say to the next administration, try to keep up.
Nice. So I do think this administration has had an impressive record on spectrum reallocation, and it's been a priority both at the White House, in the executive branch writ large, as well as at the FCC, and it's very much to folks' credit that has gotten done, including, which I think you pointed out, but I want to go back to it for a minute, which is bringing an idea from a white paper at the FCC to proposed legislation to passage to implementation all in one presidential term is pretty extraordinary. and I hope it works. But I do think just that evolution is huge. Where I would be a little bit critical is I do think that the balance between licensed and unlicensed has probably shifted too far out of whack, particularly, so I think licensed has the strongest, most demonstrated track record for investment and job creation. I'm not suggesting there shouldn't be unlicensed. I just think the pendulum needs to swing a bit back towards licensed. I also think there has been a bit too much romanticization of sharing. Particularly dynamic sharing. I think we have a 10-year track record of what happened in white spaces, and nothing has happened in white spaces for a decade. And there has been lots of promises made, but today there are still no consumers getting any tangible benefits from the white spaces decision. I think 3.5 is an important experiment, but experiments need to run their course, and you need to get data from them and before you start extrapolating and putting them into other bands. So I do think we need to be careful about becoming overly enthusiastic or enraptured with new technologies that allow for some capabilities, some spectrum sharing capabilities, without figuring out whether or not they work in the marketplace. And when you devote a resource as scarce and valuable as spectrum to that kind of experimentation, you need to be particularly cautious.
So I just wanted to add to what Brian was just saying, and also to David, which is, yes, we are having this incentive auction, and depending on what actually happens, that will be an introduction of additional spectrum. Of course, it's in the low band, and as you don't need to be a spectrum expert or an engineer to know that the pendulum in terms of focus is on the high band, because that's where you're going to get the capacity. And when you're talking about super fast wireless broadband, that's what you're going to need. So this issue of, okay, we've got the incentive auction and therefore we're going to have all of this additional spectrum, while true, I just caution against this sense that we've basically solved the need for a spectrum pipeline. I think there continues to be a tremendous need for additional spectrum going forward. I think one shift because of the election was, I think most folks were assuming sharing was going to play a tremendous role going forward in terms of decision-making on spectrum policy, and perhaps that is not necessarily true. And I would caution, just as Brian did, against embracing that idea of sharing, solving all of our problems as really it should be explored, but not at the expense of continuing to push the envelope on where we're going to get additional spectrum for license use and how we're going to get it allocated into the marketplace. Really important, and now is not the time for us to take a step back and sort of buy into this idea that we have what we need for the next decade.
Yeah, just to echo that, at least for, I think, the Democratic members of my committee, I think they completely agree. They're ready. They stand ready to work with anyone who wants to work with them to get more spectrum in the pipeline.
Let's go to questions. Yeah, over there. And please identify yourself.
Sure. So my name's Amanda Arnold, and I handle many issues in Washington, D.C. for universities. In this case, Arizona State University is watching communications fairly closely, but this is certainly my thought, not theirs. So anything you don't like is me. Anything you do like is them. So anyway, my question is sort of, going to this new transition, we've had a president-elect who has talked about actually potentially limiting internet access, right? Who knows if that's going to be on a personal basis, on a community basis, who knows? But he's mentioned this, and it's getting that, I think, clip from one of his speeches, and I think it was in Ohio, has been played several times. So how does that play into at least raising interest around these issues, if not actually into these issues? And then also, of course, Wheeler's leaving FCC, which I think was obvious that was going to happen. So who might take the place? Do we know? And if it follows sort of the tradition of the current membership and nominations, who might that be? And just welcome any thoughts on sort of really what the next 4 years could look like. Thank you.
Maybe limiting access was his own access. Thoughts?
I mean, I'm not familiar with the quote, actually, so I feel I'm not well informed to answer that. But I will say, in terms of who the future leadership is, we have two very strong Republican commissioners at the FCC, Ajit Pai and Mike O'Reilly, who have sat on the commission for a number of years, been involved in these issues for decades. I think they have strong track records that allow you to predict with some certainty what at least the short-term priorities are going to be. And so I think more than in most cases, you have, unlike at FERC where there actually are no Republicans left, there is actually the ability to look at the FCC and have some window into what's going to happen.
Well, it would be ironic if this was the return of the fairness doctrine, wouldn't it? people should take it seriously. I mean, even though it may not even have been meant seriously, it should be taken seriously. The history of the fairness doctrine should be taken seriously. On the morning or the earlier panel, we did hear about some of these efforts internationally to license organs of the press. There's a discussion in this country about fake news now that's somewhat unnerving in terms of the implications for potential regulatory involvement. So yeah, I mean, these are things to watch out for, and I do have a chapter on the fairness doctrine, and thanks for asking about it. But by the way, strong supporters of the fairness doctrine, we're conservatives, and very many conservative organizations and conservative politicians like Newt Gingrich. Yeah, some of these things are, if you're living in Washington, you almost get nothing about it. Cite November 8th, 2016. But yeah, that I think we have to take it seriously, and there should be full discussion of many of these things.
Questions? Yeah.
John Mansell, consultant. I'm wondering if the panelists could comment on the prospects for zero rating.
Well, going to Brian's comment earlier in terms of predictability about what the next FCC will look like, we do know what Commissioners Ajit Pai and O'Reilly think about the topic. I think they've been not shy. I think there is a hope that however that final set of folks are on the 8th floor at the FCC when they're put in place and confirmed, and we know exactly who we're dealing with, that there will be a recognition of the consumer upsides. And going back to my comment earlier, I think there is a suspicion that a lot of the hysteria around zero rating is raised by the same folks who are pushing a particular view of net neutrality that is all about advantaging certain companies versus others. And, if in fact this president is actually going to be about, the folks who voted him into office, these are the same constituents that subscribe and are embracing zero rating. So one would think that it should be on fine ground. But again, I think we have to wait and see what the final panel is.
I guess just a couple thoughts on that. One is I do think it's passingly strange that the outgoing administration is weighing in on this, but putting that aside, I guess. Look, we don't know what economic models are going to work on the internet, and one of the reasons I was concerned about no-pay prioritization or about banning zero rating is we just don't know. And part of the strength of our economy has always been letting companies try to figure it out. I want to protect consumers, and if we end up there's consumer harm at the end of the day, we have tools with which to address that. But I think it is inconsistent with the public interest to preclude those types of innovative business models now before we know what works, before we know what consumers want. And so I think it's been a mistake to be pass prophylactic rules about that. I think we should allow the marketplace to experiment with these different models and be vigilant on the enforcement side if there's some anti-competitive conduct that harms consumers or competition.
Yeah, zero rating was targeted in the 2010 order, the net neutrality order that was overturned and so forth. It's long been a target of the net neutrality rule. Certainly Title II would throw it into question. But the point is, do regulators really have the stomach to do something that's so blatantly anti-consumer? I mean, to attack T-Mobile. Metro PCS was the one they actually attacked in the 2010 order. And I wrote a little book on it. I made the mistake of, on net neutrality. You don't have to buy that one. But anyway,
Is it a package deal?
No, I made the mistake of actually reading some comments, and people said that we had pulled. I just sort of made up this Metro PCS example. Well, the Metro PCS example was from the order. I mean, that was what was suggested as an example of non-neutrality that could create anti-competitive problems and was actionable, and was the first complaint filed under the order. Obviously, everything was set aside, and then it was overturned, and then we got the new Title II this past year. But I think that's, zero rating being illegal has got to be dead. That's zero right now, because it's I just, as I said, I have a hard time thinking that the current FCC would, how much stomach would they have? You say it has to be pro-consumer. I mean, this is blatantly anti-consumer. And economists get that, and consumers get that.
Tricia Paoletta from Harrisville Tringranis. I don't know if this is on, but I'll speak loudly. Not to put David on the spot, but the whole panel, and you know, you can look across your aisle or the other chamber to the Senate too, because the president did advocate for Title II, and you know, obviously there were a lot of other broader groups that were doing that as well. So Democrats were taking input from a lot of groups. I mean, politically, what do you think is the ability for the Senate or for the group at large to go back and approach open internet, net neutrality, you know, beyond that classification issue? I mean, can we get to a place where there's bipartisan agreement, where we were in 2010 before the the waters were muddied with Title II? Is there a way to go back and have a bipartisan consensus on how to protect consumers without, you know, undermining innovative business solutions like this, without calling it, you know, Title II?
I don't know.
Tell me what the Senate's going to do, David.
Yeah, well, they have an interesting committee on these issues. So, but you know, the thing I'll say is that on both sides, the House and Senate, the Commerce committees are actually have a history of being pretty bipartisan. And I mean, even in these times, we're pretty good. I know, speaking for my committee, we've passed a number of bipartisan bills this year, sent them over to the Senate. Now, that's their problem. But it's both sides do work together well. Now, whether we can pull off net neutrality, I don't know. But I think if it can be done, these are the committees that could do it, and not just because it's the only people who know what they're doing, but these are the committees. We all get along. We've all worked together for a long time. The members know each other well. So it's hard. I mean, you say turn back the clock to 2010. We can't. So we'll have to see what happens. I'm not sure. I wish I could give a better answer. I just don't know.
Hi, Ashley Gold, Politico. I'm gonna put David on the spot again. Can you can you speak at all to Congressman Walden's appetite to perhaps rolling back some of the FCC's initiatives spearheaded by Chairman Wheeler?
That doesn't put me in the spot at all. I cannot speak for Chairman Walden at all. No, I don't know. I mean, I can't speak for him at all. It's all I can say, just in general, and this is kind of similar answers. Congressman Pallone, that I work for, has a great working relationship with Chairman Walden, and so hopefully we can continue to do things in bipartisan way. Hopefully they don't come in and try to start pushing a lot of just rolling back consumer protections just because. And so hopefully we can work together and try to get productive stuff done in the next Congress.
Any others? Right here. Come in the other way.
I'll put Professor Hazlett on the spot. And by the way, we do miss you at the now Antonin Scalia School of Law. You touched on it a brief in terms of the connected car, where we have this week the U.S. Department of Transportation releasing an NPRM that's essentially regulating the wireless connectivity of V2V. How is the commission kind of going forward going to be able to preserve or define its role where we do have car companies and companies like IBM and other companies now kind of entering the sort of ICT or telco space in terms of preserving almost the integrity of regulation here?
Wow, Jesus. Scott, why don't you ask me one of the easy ones? I would like some help from my panelists, my fellow panelists on this one. I mean, certainly there is an interagency battle, yeah, and I'm not intimately involved in it right now. I mean, obviously there's intense interest, not just at the FCC for obvious reasons, with vehicle telematics and informatics, and wireless is a huge part of that, you know, and spectrum allocation is in the middle of it. So, you know, how you have interagency cooperation is a very technical issue that you know, I'm not geared up on that. That's why I'm desperately flailing. But you know, if you know, tell us. But I don't. I mean, I have focused obviously on the spectrum allocation aspect of it and read some of those proceedings. And, it's hard enough just doing spectrum allocation and fending off the interest groups that want to have the rules tweaked for their own applications. And you can see the infirmities of the current case-by-case spectrum allocation system from reading those. If you go out and jump to other agencies, you bring the interagency mix into it, that becomes even more ridiculous in terms of regulatory delay. And I do just want to say one thing to David. When we talk about the speed of the spectrum allocations under the 2010 National Broadband Plan, and he says that we've done well. Okay, well, you can have that view, and there is an argument to be made. For example, there was a statute passed in just 2 years, which you noted, and that was remarkably fast. Okay, I was one of those who said, don't go to Congress and get a law. You can do it with overlays that don't need a law. Okay, there are a lot of ways to do things faster, and don't come back and say later that we did stuff that was really hard, much better than we thought. Okay, there's still a lot of spectrum in the TV band that's not going to be productively used in any way after this whole thing is over. And it's going to take a long time. The National Broadband Plan said 6 to 13 years. This was the critique, and it's absolutely correct. 6 to 13 years was the average spectrum allocation, and we have to do something. It's a crisis that we go so long, 6 to 13 years. Well, the incentive auction is going to take 6 to 13 years. We hope there's something at the end of 13 years. So I think we have to be real critical about this and real hard-headed and really try the options on this. And by the way, there was a 300 megahertz goal for more licensed flexible use spectrum by 2015. We didn't come anywhere close to that. We might have made it halfway. And the stuff that did get out, like AWS-3, which was very nice, that stuff started all previous to 2004 in terms of rolling through the regulatory system. So nobody beat 6 to 13 years on that. Anyway, that's just in the nature of somebody looking to Washington and saying, look, your metrics are wrong. You got to think more outside the box.
So I actually don't want to disagree with that. I think on average, you're right. I mean, on average, it's about, say, 8 years from the time spectrum is identified until it's out on the market. And that's things going well. I'm not sure we're going to be able to keep that under the current system up at that speed. I actually hope this is something that the next administration does work on. Shortening that amount of time, and your overlays idea is a great, smart, interesting idea. I hope that's something that they consider, along with looking at the 3.5 model, what works, what doesn't, and seeing if there's things to be tweaked and taken on. But honestly, one of the best things that I think this administration could do is shrink the time from identifying spectrum until getting it on the market. That is absolutely, you're absolutely right. I couldn't agree more on that.
And let me just say, Commissioner Rosenworcel does get very positive notice in the book because she has been an innovator on this, and she's recommended auctioning hunting licenses for spectrum allocated to public agencies, and she's been an articulate champion of that. And that's an overlay idea applied to government allocated spectrum, and it's a very serious idea that has lots of potential benefits. It really deserves to get more
So
play.
with that final plug for Tom's book, but go ahead.
I just want to follow up on the actual question for a minute. I do think there is a big a looming issue, especially for the IoT world and all the verticals in which spectrum and wireless connectivity play such an important role in. There's a fragmentation problem, there's a rent-seeking problem, and it's true for the education sector, it's true for transportation, it's true for all the areas in which wireless connectivity has the opportunity to change people's lives for the better. We as a country need to figure out how to have a unified approach to these things. One, for example, is to try to move some of this regulatory overlay, if you will, to the Federal Trade Commission, where they look across the economy instead of looking sector specific. That helps. Tom pointed out the need for inter-bureau or interagency coordination, which does become particularly important as these verticals take on added import. But the cybersecurity impacts are immense. The economic impact is substantial. We aren't thinking enough about what the IoT regime looks like and how to be smart about looking across different sectors of the economy and having a unified worldview. We think that privacy is confusing, where you have HIPAA and you have privacy, CP&I, and you have all these different sector specific. IoT is going to have the same component across all these different policy aspects. So it's a big concern that I think the new administration is going to be challenged by, as this one has been.
Okay, so thanks the panelists very much. And on behalf of TPI and ITIF, thank you for everyone for coming. Also to TPI staff is always great, Amy Smorodin and Ashley Benjamin. Also just want to say it was a delight working with ITIF, and Harry Klapsis was amazing, Rob Atkinson as always. So thank you all very much.